Yes. 2-5 is here. Sports Reports is ordered 2-5 daily. Like, review, subscribe, share, rate, do all the free things. Do all the good things. So I wanted to talk to you tonight. We're going to talk some college football playoff rankings, right? We're going to talk some G5 and what that's going to entail, who the G5 contenders are to make that playoff. And then Thursday night football, Bengals and Ravens. We're going to talk about that a little bit. So for the next week or so, I'm going to be recording these and uploading. And then next week we'll be live again. All right. So let's get right to it. The college football rankings came out last night. I had a bunch of questions. I had no answers. But these things will play themselves out. But instead of me waiting for it to play out, we could just talk about it, right? Like I was like, yo, why is Penn State and Texas ahead of BYU? Not even because BYU's undefeated and they're not. Because Georgia beat Texas, and you got to give them credit for that game. Even though it's a loss, BYU hasn't played anybody of that caliber. BYU hasn't played anybody of the caliber of Penn State losing to Ohio State. But when I look at it, it's not about who you lost to. It's about who you beat. I value wins instead of losses. You know, we get to that at the end of the season because everybody looks good on paper, except for maybe Indiana with that strength of schedule. But everybody looks good on paper, and then you weigh them all against each other and you go through all these things. But for the moment, I can only do what's happened to date. So BYU has wins over SMU and Kansas State, who are both ranked. You know, they have a favorable schedule. You know, they got the Holy War this weekend against Utah, but outside of that favorable schedule to get to the Big 12 championship game undefeated. Question is, if they lose that game, the Big 12 championship game, do they still get in? Can the Big 12 get two? I guess that's going to depend on what the ACC does. And that's why I bring up SMU, because their only loss is to BYU. It was at their place, though, and it was a last possession game. You know, SMU had the ball and had a turnover late. So, if they make the ACC title game, and this has to be, for this scenario to work, it has to be an undefeated Miami. So, let's say they lose to Miami. Let's call it, you know, a 10-point game. Nothing crazy. Can I look at this team and say, your only losses are to two conference champions who are both undefeated? You're not good enough to be in the playoff. While I might let Tennessee in, you know, for beating a 3-loss Alabama potentially, but losing to Georgia, maybe big, you know, having a loss on the road at Arkansas, which I know the SEC is tough. Every week is a war, but it's Arkansas, right? The same team that Ole Miss just put 63 on this weekend. We got a big one this weekend, Georgia and Ole Miss at Oxford. Keep your eye on that, because that could change this whole dynamic of the conversation that I'm having if Ole Miss can pull that upset. But can SMU get in with those two losses if they're to those two teams? Now, in this other scenario, SMU wins out all the way, beats undefeated Miami in the ACC title game. Can Miami get in? I think so. I think it's more likely than SMU, just based off of name and brand. You saw the rankings last night. It was all about brand. That's why you had a team like Tennessee ahead of Indiana. Now, Indiana, like I said, they beat Ohio State, all is well. Doesn't really matter if they lose to Michigan. They'll take the hit for it. But if they turn back around and beat Ohio State, guess what? They'd be in the Big Ten championship game, you know, if they beat Purdue, of course. You know, but the reason that I say that is because Indiana would have one conference loss, Ohio State would have two, Penn State would have one, albeit to Ohio State. So you would make that Penn State Indiana comparison. These teams don't play each other because of how big these conferences are. But then, you know, you look at the head-to-heads, neither one played Oregon. Only one of them played Michigan. They both would have played Ohio State, and Indiana would have got the win. They both would have played Maryland. More than likely, both win. Indiana already beat them. So in that scenario, it takes care of itself. Indiana goes to the Big Ten championship game, even if they lose to Oregon, albeit as long as they don't lose by 30. they'll probably get into the playoff. But if they lose that game to Ohio State, everything changes unless Michigan beats Ohio State. But then they're back in the conversation. But albeit, let's think about this realistically. Ohio State beats Michigan in that scenario, finishes with one loss, Indiana with their one loss to Ohio State, Penn State with their one loss to Ohio State. Depending on how that goes, would the committee really put Indiana in over Penn State when we think about brands? Think about it. Would they? That's what I want to know. So let me know your thoughts. And I'm sorry, y'all. I'm just battling some allergies here. So, just stay with me, y'all. But then, let's talk about this G5 style. Does the college football need Boise to be the G5 representative to bring legitimacy to the system? Because I know when the playoff was first announced, G5 was going to get a spot because it's the top 5 conference champions. There's only 4 power conferences. I know people out there were like, I don't want a 3-loss, Sun Belt team. I don't want a 2-loss AAC team. Okay, well, let's stay with it. Boise ranked number 12, only lost on the road at Autzen Stadium, 37-34 back in week 2, back when Oregon needed a punt return and kick return to get out of there with that game. They bring Ashton Jeanty. His Heisman chances are probably dwindling and probably absent now. But still exciting, still going to rush for 2,000 yards. We get to see him against big competition. Now, if Boise gets in, since they're situated at number 12 right now, is it possible that Boise could finish higher than 12? For example, if Colorado wins out, gets to the Big 12 championship game and win, how far can they jump from the 20s that they're in right now? Maybe you jump them over everybody because they're a conference champ. I don't know. But let's just say you don't, so then you would have Boise potentially finish number 4. What if Iowa State wins that conference, the Big 12? So if it's not BYU, then that 4th position is up for grabs. What if it's SMU that wins the ACC, going back to that scenario? Could Boise State be placed ahead of SMU? Now, Boise brings credibility and they bring that brand recognition that I was talking about. We go back to 2008 with Ian Johnson proposing to his girlfriend after beating Oklahoma in the Fiesta Bowl. Boise has beaten other big boys over the years. Oregon, when they beat them this year, was the first time Oregon ever beat them. You tell me how that works. But who are the other contenders? But before we do that, let's look at Boise's remaining schedule. Nevada at San Jose State. That's a tough game now. I know, don't laugh at it. Coached by Ken Niumatalolo from Navy. You remember him? At Wyoming and Oregon State at home to finish the season. I think they go 4-0 in that scenario. They just beat UNLV 2 weeks ago on a Friday night. Can they beat them twice in the season? Can you beat the same team twice? If not, can you beat Colorado State if they get to the title game? We'll get to all these teams later, but I'm just asking these questions. Army was number 25 in that same top 25. Are they going to be able to jump Boise? So if Boise wins out and Army wins out, even though Army's undefeated, they're not going to have the schedule that Boise had. So I think Boise still gets in, but this is the key. This is the key because, like I said, Army has to win out. November 23rd, they go to South Bend, Indiana. Are they live? I think so. Bryson Daly, provided he's back, leading the nation in rushing touchdowns. So, but looking at Army's remaining schedule, they got North Texas this weekend, a bye. That game at Notre Dame, they get UTSA and Navy to close out the year. Potentially the AAC championship game, most likely against Tulane. We'll get to that. But with the problem with Army, the reason that I said they can't jump Boise is when you look at their schedule, they're the only team that they beat with a winning record, and that has the best record of the teams that they played, is their FCS opponent, Lehigh. They beat ECU. That's probably their best win. That ain't going to cut it. Now, when we get to the end of the season, if they have a Notre Dame win, I can tell Boise, hey, you're tough, but you lost your game to Oregon. So I'm just throwing it out there. The combined record for Army's opponents, 20-35. So that's what's going to sink them in this conversation. You got Tulane in the same conference as Army. Only losses at home against Kansas State on a bad no call. Should have been pass interference. Game should have been going to overtime, but it wasn't called. Therefore, they lost. They lost at Norman before we knew how bad Oklahoma was. So maybe that comes back to bite them. You say, hey, they lost to that Oklahoma team. Even though you're going to turn right around and call them a tough opponent for somebody like Ole Miss because they're in the SEC, let's keep it consistent. Now, remaining schedule, Temple, at Navy, in the rivalry game against Memphis, who could still be alive, but they're in a free fall right now. They lost to Navy, giving up 56 points, and then they just lost to UTSA. That ain't going to get it done. They have the win over Florida State, which any other year you would say, great job, let them in. Not this year. Not this year. You got Louisiana, whose only loss is to Tulane. But the problem with Louisiana is they play in the Sun Belt Conference. They have a lot of schools people don't recognize. Georgia Southern, UL Monroe, Old Dominion, Coastal Carolina. These names don't sound like juggernauts, right? So remaining schedule, Arkansas State, South Alabama, Troy, all three at home somehow, and then at UL Monroe in their rivalry game, who started 5-1, but they've lost 2 in a row now. So Louisiana has the path, but they don't have the win. They don't have anything to lean on. UNLV shares the conference with Boise State. You remember them? Beat 2 Big 12 teams this year. Remember that? Beat Houston to start the season, beat Kansas on a Friday night, but they lost to they lost to Boise State. They lost to Syracuse in overtime at home. Both of those games were at home, both of them on a Friday night. Stay away from Friday nights, UNLV. But they lost their quarterback. Remember the whole NIL big deal schluck, and now Hajj Malik Williams comes in, adds a whole new element to their offense. But their run defense leaves a lot to be desired, even though they held Ashton Genty to 120 or so yards. I mean, granted, that's a good game, but that just wasn't what he was doing at that time. We were talking about him challenging Barry Sanders for the single season record. That game was the game that started to get him out of the running for that. So their remaining schedule this weekend, tricky one, not because of the team, time zone. Well, not necessarily time zone because they're only on the West Coast and they're moving over, but they go to Hawaii. They go to the island. San Diego State at home, close at San Jose State. And then our last team, Colorado State. They have to win the Mountain West. Obviously, they can't even be taken seriously if they do. They started the season getting shut out by Texas. They lost in overtime at Oregon State up in Corvallis. Then they got dominated 28-9 by the Buffaloes. All right. So if Boise's in pole position and they beat Boise for the Mountain West title, because right now Colorado State has an advantage that UNLV doesn't. They're undefeated in conference. So if they can get through and beat Boise, they might have a chance, depending on what everybody else that I just named does. Maybe Navy could get back into the conversation if they can get through, beat Tulane, but they are in a free fall right now. They got killed by Notre Dame 2 weeks ago, turned around and lost to lost to Rice. Shout out to Josh Pate for that reference. But what are we doing here? So I think Navy's all but done, so that's the G5 race. I mean, but that brings me back to the original question. Does the college football playoff need Boise to win out and get into the playoff to legitimize the system? All right. And finally, Thursday night football, big AFC North battle. One team trying to keep pace with the first place team, one team trying to stay alive in the playoff race. Sitting at 4-5, the Cincinnati Bengals going to the Baltimore Ravens. These teams played a few weeks ago in the Queen City, which throws me off always because when I think of the Queen City, I think of Charlotte. But apparently Cincinnati's the Queen City too. Both quarterbacks have been lighting it up. Lamar Jackson is an MVP candidate right now. Not necessarily my MVP candidate. I think Josh Allen is the MVP right now. But that's just me. But Joe Burrow has been having probably his best season of his career. The problem is that he would be an MVP candidate if their defense outside of Trey Hendrickson would show up. Trey Hendrickson leads the league in sacks with 11, had 4 last week against Las Vegas. So obviously Baltimore is going to be trying to neutralize him. The problem with Baltimore that they run into sometimes on offense is that this offensive line is brand new. I've been talking about it all off season. They started slow. They replaced 3 offensive linemen that they lost in free agency or trade, right? So that's always going to be tough. They seem to be getting into the swing of things now. Derrick Henry has scored a touchdown in every game. Both these teams have awful secondaries that Baltimore has tried to remedy by bringing in Trey White. We'll see if he plays this weekend. But even if he does, he's coming off of an ACL. He hasn't looked the same yet. So it's going to take some time. And I don't know if trying to defend Jamar Chase is your answer. If T. Higgins is back, that's the problem. He's been out. Is he back? Can you defend him? So Cincinnati, the Ravens, number 1 in the league in offense, 446 yards per game. Lead the league in rushing. They've scored 40 points 3 times, including that game in Cincinnati a few weeks ago, where Cincinnati had a 10-point lead off and on throughout the fourth quarter and couldn't put it away. Lamar Jackson made plays to get the game to overtime. Cincinnati missed a field goal. Here they are, 4-5. I ain't going to say their playoff lives are on the line, but if they lose this game, they'd be swept by the Ravens, and they have beat Cleveland, so they're 1-2 in the division. So they got Pittsburgh twice after that, and Deshaun Watson's not playing for Cleveland anymore, so who knows? But you're 4-5. You got Denver in front of you. You got the Chargers in front of you. You have to keep pace, and you got the Dolphins on your tail, right? So Chase Brown has now taken over the starting position at running back. He's been killing it. Last week against the Raiders, had a big game, had a touchdown, had 120 yards rushing. Now, they picked up Khalil Herbert from the Chicago Bears. Will we see him tomorrow? How effective can he be? The question in this game for me is can Cincinnati stop Baltimore? Because if it comes down to a shootout, as we saw before, I think Baltimore can make one more defensive play than Cincinnati can. Because outside of Trey Hendrickson and Jermaine Pratt, I'm not impressed with that defense at all. Now, the Bengals point blank need this game. They're dangerous because of that. Animal in wounded mode, back against the wall, all those good things. So we know that they can score. So that's why I say it's going to come down to defense. So when I look at this, I think Cincinnati matches up with Baltimore well. We've seen close games between these two throughout the years. They even win on each other's fields sometimes. But I'm just going to take Baltimore, like I said, to make one more defensive play. I'm going to call it 35-31. Derrick Henry's going to keep his streak alive of scoring a touchdown in every game this season. Chase Brown will get some yards against Baltimore's defense, which will open up play action and deep passes for Joe Burrow to Jamar Chase. Evicious, I think that's the tight end's name. I can't pronounce it. But, him and Mike Gesicki give Joe Burrow another weapon. So Cincinnati is very live in this game. I just think Baltimore is going to make the extra play. But thanks for joining me here on 2-5 Daily. Sports Reports' Order will be back on Friday with picks, and more picks. NFL, college football, some NBA thoughts. Like, review, subscribe, share, rate. Do all the free things. Do all the good things. Thanks for suffering through my allergies with me. Peace.